The storm came without warning, its darkened skies swallowing the horizon as dust whipped through the air. When the winds cleared, his shelter stood alone in the desolation, mocked by neighbors, but untouched by the wrath of nature. Before we dive into this story, tell us where you're watching from, and if tales of survival inspire you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just outlast this one. The wind howled across the barren land, cutting through the bones of the prairie with a cruel, unyielding force. By September 1934, the Dust Bowl had already ravaged most of the heartland, but nothing could prepare the people of western Oklahoma for the storm that would come in the days ahead. They had seen dust storms before, thick, choking clouds that blotted out the sun, but this black blizzard, would be different. In the middle of this devastated landscape stood a simple structure, its wooden frame barely rising above the mound of earth that surrounded it. To those who passed by, it seemed like little more than a mockery, an oversized shack built with too much care and not enough sense. The other homesteaders, many of whom were struggling to scrape by, mocked the man who built it. They called it a fool's shelter. Why spend precious time, money, and lumber on something so elaborate, they asked, when the wind and dust would blow it away in the end? That man was Henry Caldwell. A tall, broad-shouldered figure, his face marked by years of hard labor and hardship, Henry paid no mind to the whispers that followed him as he worked. He knew his shelter would stand. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of instinct that only comes from facing the land's fury over and over again. The others might have built their houses quickly, slapping together whatever they could find, but Henry was different. He had come from a line of farmers who knew the weight of the earth beneath their feet and the power of the winds above. He built his shelter with care, making sure the walls were thick and reinforced with heavy timber. He placed the doorway facing the east, knowing that was the direction the wind would blow hardest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry stood back and looked at his creation, dust still clinging to his boots. He felt a strange peace wash over him. The shelter wasn't just a structure, it was a statement, a quiet defiance against the world that seemed hell-bent on tearing everything down. The prairie might have taken the crops, the livestock, and the lives of many of his neighbors, but it wouldn't take this. Days passed, and the winds that had been gentle whispers turned into roaring beasts. Henry's shelter, now a beacon of solid construction amidst the surrounding ruins, stood firm. But the other settlers, struggling to keep their homes intact, couldn't understand his slow, deliberate process. They had no time for finesse, not when the storms were coming fast and without mercy. They had to work quickly, fix their roofs, patch their walls, store whatever food they could before the next storm hit. By the time October rolled around, the black blizzards had become a fixture of life. No one was spared from their destructive force. On the 15th, the air thickened, growing so dense with dust that Henry could barely see the end of his own hand. A weight seemed to settle over the land, the very earth sighing under the relentless pressure. The storm raged for 3 days, its darkened clouds blotting out the sun and choking every living thing in its path. Neighbors huddled inside their homes, desperate to protect what little they had left. Inside Henry's shelter, it was warm. The thick double walls, layered with insulation from sawdust and earth, kept the cold at bay. The wind rattled against the timbers, but it couldn't get in. He had planned for this very storm. The fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. As the hours stretched on, Henry's thoughts wandered to those who had mocked him. He knew they were struggling, most of them were. The howling winds were not just a nuisance, they were a force that could strip away everything in an instant. And for those who hadn't taken the time to build for the worst, it would be a long, hard winter. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. The dust filled every crevice, every crack, and it seemed that even the very air had turned against them. Yet, inside his cabin, Henry sat by the fire, watching the storm through the small window. He thought about the future. He thought about his family, the ones who had come west with him, and those who would find their way to his shelter when their own homes no longer held. He knew it wouldn't be long before the others realized their mistake. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about enduring. By mid-November, the relentless winds had become a constant companion, always threatening, always biting. The prairie was a desolate wasteland, its once fertile soil now barren and cracked. The black blizzards had taken their toll on the land, but they had taken an even greater toll on the people. Starvation, disease, and despair crept into every home, bringing with them the slow death of hope. Henry's shelter stood like a fortress against the chaos outside, its thick walls untouched by the dust storms. The fire within burned brightly each evening, warming the space where he worked tirelessly to preserve what little they had left. Supplies were dwindling, but Henry had planned for this, and he knew how to make each ration stretch. He wasn't just preparing for himself, he had built his home for others too. It wasn't long before word began to spread. As the storms became more frequent, as the dust choked every breath, the neighboring settlers began to realize they could no longer survive on their own. The railroad had stopped running months ago, and the distant town of Desmet was now unreachable. Those who had mocked Henry's shelter now found themselves with nowhere to turn. On the 2nd of December, Peter Johnson arrived. He had been living 5 miles north of Henry's place, a homestead much like the others in the area. The blizzard had taken its toll on his cabin. The roof had caved in, and the walls, thin and hastily built, couldn't hold back the cold. His family, already weakened from months of struggling, were now at death's door. His wife had developed pneumonia, and his 3 children were showing signs of frostbite. As Peter trudged through the snow, the storm raging all around him, he saw the faint glow of light in the distance. Smoke rose from the chimney of Henry's shelter, steady, unbroken by the winds. He staggered toward it, his energy all but spent, praying he wasn't too late. When Henry opened the door, he didn't hesitate. Without a word, he pulled Peter and his family inside, wrapping them in the warmth of the shelter. It was a stark contrast to the outside world, a world filled with nothing but howling winds and suffocating dust. Inside, the fire roared, and the warmth was almost too much for Peter's frozen body to handle. But it was the warmth they needed. For 3 days, Peter's family stayed. The fire never once faltered, and Henry never left their side. He tended to them with quiet care, offering what little food he had left and sharing his firewood. As Peter lay awake at night, listening to the howling storm outside, he could hardly believe the sight before him. The shelter, which had once seemed excessive, now felt like a miracle. It was the difference between life and death. On the 3rd morning, as the storm began to ease, Peter sat up, fully aware of the magnitude of what had just occurred. His wife, still weak but alive, looked over at Henry, who stood by the fire, his eyes focused on the flames. "Thank you," Peter whispered, his voice hoarse from days of exposure. Henry simply nodded, his gaze never leaving the fire. "Survival is a choice," he said softly. "You can't wait for the world to tell you what you need. You have to build it yourself." By the time February arrived, the storms had grown worse. The black blizzards that had once been occasional visitors now seemed like permanent guests, and they had made it clear they wouldn't leave until they had taken everything. Every homestead in the area had been tested, some had fallen to the storm, their shelters not strong enough to endure. But Henry's shelter still stood, and it became more than just a refuge, it became a symbol. As the months passed, more and more settlers made their way to Henry's place, each with their own tale of loss, each with a desperate need for warmth, for food, and for something that resembled hope. The cabin, once ridiculed, was now a place of safety, a sanctuary for those who had lost everything else. And still, Henry gave without question. The fire never went out. The food stores, though dwindling, stretched just a little farther each day. The shelter, though simple, had become a lifeline for more people than Henry had ever imagined. And yet, the storm outside only grew fiercer. March brought another massive blizzard. It was a storm unlike any the area had seen, and even Henry's shelter felt the strain. The wind tore at the wooden walls, the snow piling high around the cabin, but still, it stood. The temperature plummeted to unbearable lows, and the prairie, once a place of dreams and opportunity, was now nothing but a frozen wasteland. Inside the shelter, it was different. Though the blizzards outside screamed for attention, inside, the air was warm, the fire steady, and the sound of the wind was but a faint whisper against the strength of the walls. On the evening of March 15th, as Henry and the others sat by the fire, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was William Crawford, the neighbor who had once mocked Henry's shelter, the one who had called him foolish for building it too large, too strong. He stepped inside, his face drawn and weathered from months of fighting against the storm. Henry didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. He simply nodded toward the fire, offering Crawford a place to sit. Crawford, looking at the warmth, the people gathered around, and the shelter that had held up against everything the world had thrown at it, finally spoke. "You were right," he said quietly. "I was wrong." Henry said nothing, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He didn't need to be vindicated. He had built the shelter for this moment, for the storms that never ended, and he would keep building as long as there were people who needed shelter from the storm. The winter of 1935 finally broke, and when it did, it was as though the earth exhaled a long, exhausted breath. The winds, which had seemed endless, stilled for the first time in months. The skies, which had once been blackened by the churning dust, were now clear and empty. The land, however, was scarred. The once fertile soil of Oklahoma's plains was now little more than dust and rock, the remnants of lives that had been lived with hope and ambition now buried under layers of loss. Inside Henry's shelter, the warmth remained. The fire that had burned through the worst of it still flickered in the stone hearth. It had been through the worst of the storms and yet stood untouched, a beacon of endurance and quiet defiance. The cabin, which had once been the subject of ridicule, had become a symbol of survival. It wasn't just a building, it was a testament to what it meant to fight back against the land that seemed intent on taking everything. And Henry Caldwell, the man who had built it, had become more than just a homesteader. He had become a leader, an unwitting hero to those who had come to him for refuge. As the storm eased and spring cautiously began to reclaim the land, the Barry Sioux, settlers who had come to his door, began to rebuild. Some of them stayed, taking up residence around Henry's shelter, growing crops where the land would allow it, and repairing the damage that the storm had wrought on their own homes. But Henry wasn't one to bask in the quiet glory of survival. He knew that though the dust had cleared, the future was still uncertain. The land was broken, the storms were unpredictable, and the struggle wasn't over. For the first time in years, there was no storm on the horizon, no dust cloud rising to swallow the earth, but Henry understood that there would always be another challenge, another trial, another test of endurance. On April 1st, as the sun began to warm the earth for the first time in months, Henry made his way outside the shelter to survey the land. He knew that it would take more than just physical strength to rebuild. It would take imagination, it would take determination, and most of all, it would take community. The land may have been harsh, but it had always been about more than just one man's fight against nature. It had been about the people who had fought beside him, the ones who had taken refuge in the shelter, and the ones who had offered their hands to help. As he walked along the edge of the property, he saw the makeshift homes that had sprouted up around his shelter. He saw the men and women working together, building new homes, and gathering whatever food they could find from the earth. There was still dust in the air, still a quiet silence hanging over the land, but there was also something more. There was life, still fighting to survive. Henry paused at the edge of his shelter and looked back at the structure that had become so much more than just four walls. It had been a symbol of his determination, but it had also become a symbol for everyone who had come to him for help. They had found not just protection from the storms, but they had found strength in each other, a sense of community that had been absent in the harshest days of the Dust Bowl. It was a strange thing, he thought, how a simple structure could bring people together, how it could offer more than just shelter, it could offer hope. The door to the shelter creaked open, and Henry turned to see Peter Johnson standing in the doorway. Peter had been the first to seek refuge in the shelter during the long winter, his family barely hanging on when they arrived. But now, Peter stood tall, a man who had found his way back from the brink of despair, a man who had found his place in the world again. "You were right," Peter said, his voice quiet but steady. "About the shelter, about building for the worst." Henry nodded, his eyes meeting Peter's. "I wasn't trying to be right," he replied. "I was trying to survive. We all were." Peter stepped forward, his eyes scanning the land. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said. "The land's still broken, the dust is still here. But we've got something we didn't have before, a place to stand, a place to build." Henry's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on Peter's shoulder. "It's not just about surviving anymore, Peter," he said. "It's about living." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching as the others worked together side by side, rebuilding their lives from the wreckage left behind by the storms. Henry had never been a man of many words, but in this moment he understood something that he hadn't fully grasped before. It wasn't just about the land or the shelter. It was about the people, their spirit, their strength, and their will to keep fighting, no matter what the future held. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, Henry felt a strange peace. He had built something that had withstood the worst the land could throw at it. But more importantly, he had built a community, a place where people could come together, where they could rebuild, and where they could hold on to something when everything else seemed to be slipping away. Henry's shelter was more than just a home. It was the foundation of something new. And as the days passed, the land slowly began to heal, not just from the storms that had ravaged it, but from the loneliness and despair that had once threatened to break the people who had come to call it home. The shelter stood firm, a monument to survival and resilience. And in its shadow, the community grew stronger, tighter, and more united than ever before. The storm may have passed, but the lessons it had taught would last a lifetime. And as Henry watched the sun rise over the dust-covered plains, he knew that no matter what the future held, the people of this land would survive, together.